going over IRS Form 8839, Qualified Adoption Expenses. There are three parts to this two-page tax form. Part 1, information about your eligible child or children, which every taxpayer must complete. Part 2, calculation of the adoption credit. And Part 3, employer-provided adoption benefits. Before we go on with this form, I'd like to cover a couple of administrative items. In 2022, the maximum credit and the exclusion for employer-provided benefits are both $14,890 per eligible child. This amount begins to phase out if you have modified adjusted gross income in excess of $223,410 and is completely phased out for modified adjusted gross income of $263,410 or more. You will use IRS Form 8839 to figure your adoption credit and any employer-provided adoption benefits that you can exclude from income. You can claim both the exclusion and the credit for expenses of adopting an eligible child. For example, depending on the cost of the adoption, you may be able to exclude up to $14,890 from income and also be able to claim a credit of up to $14,890. But you cannot claim a credit and an exclusion for the same expenses. All taxpayers will complete Part 1. You will complete Part 2 to figure the adoption credit that you can take on Schedule 3. You can take this credit under certain circumstances, to include if you paid adoption expenses in connection with the adoption of an eligible U.S. child. 2, you adopted an eligible U.S. child with special needs and the adoption became final in the tax year. 3, you paid qualified adoption expenses in connection with the adoption of an eligible foreign child, or if you have a carry forward of an adoption credit from previous tax years. You will use Part 3 to figure the employer-provided adoption benefits that you can exclude from income. You may be able to exclude those benefits from income if your employer had a written qualified adoption assistance program and if any of the following statements are true. 1, you received employer-provided adoption benefits in the tax year. 2, you adopted an eligible U.S. child with special needs and the adoption became final in the tax year. Or 3, you received employer-provided adoption benefits in connection with the adoption of an eligible child in 2022 or prior years and the adoption became final in 2022, or in 2022 and the adoption became final before 2022. So in Part 1, we'll go over information about your eligible child or children. As mentioned, all taxpayers must complete Part 1. An eligible child is 1, any child under the age of 18. If the child turned 18 during the tax year, the child is an eligible child for the part of the year he or she was under the age of 18. Or 2, any disabled individual who is mentally or physically unable to take care of himself or herself. In Part 1, you'll complete all columns that apply to the eligible child that you've adopted or you've tried to adopt. There are three spaces for 3 children. If you have more than three eligible children, then fill in and attach as many Forms 8839 as you need to list them. Also enter C attached to the right of the caution below line 1. So in column A, you'll list the child's first and last name. In column B, you'll list the child's year of birth. For column C, you check if the child was born before 2005 and is disabled. The IRS defines a disabled individual as one who is physically or mentally unable to care for himself or herself, and a disabled individual is considered to be an eligible child regardless of age at the time of adoption. In column D, you'll check if this is a child with special needs. A child is considered to be a child with special needs if all three of the following statements are true. 1. The child was a citizen or resident of the United States or its possessions at the time the adoption effort began. 2. A state, to include the District of Columbia, has determined that the child cannot or should not be returned to his or her parents' home. And 3. The state has determined that the child will not be adopted unless assistance is provided to the adoptive parents. There are several factors that states use to make this determination, to include the child's ethnic background and age, whether the child is a member of a minority or a sibling group, and whether the child has a medical condition or a physical, mental, or emotional handicap. In column E, you'll check the box if this is a foreign child. The IRS considers a child to be a foreign child if he or she was not a citizen or resident of the United States or its possessions at the time that the adoption effort began. In column F, you'll enter the child's identifying number, which can be a social security number, an adoption taxpayer identification number, known as an ATIN, or an individual taxpayer identification number, ITIN. You may apply for a social security number if required using Form SS5. In column G, you'll check this box if the adoption for each child became final in the tax year or earlier. If your child is a foreign child, there are special rules in the instructions which you must follow before you complete Part 2 or Part 3. If you received any employer-provided adoption benefits, complete Part 3 on the back next. We'll go to Part 2, which is the adoption credit. For line 2, you will enter $14,890. This is the maximum adoption credit for each child. If you and another person, besides your spouse, if filing jointly, each paid adoption expenses, qualified adoption expenses to adopt the same child, the $14,890 must be divided between the two of you. You can divide it in any way you both agree. So enter your share of that amount on line 2 for that child. In line 3, if you filed IRS Form 8839 for a prior year for the same child, select yes. The instructions indicate that you should enter on line 3 the total of the amounts shown on lines 3 and 6 or corresponding line for the last form that you filed for the child. If no, enter 0. In line 4, you will subtract the number in line 3 from the number in line 2. For line 5, this is your qualified adoption expenses. You may need to see the instructions for special rules if you paid expenses in connection with the adoption of an eligible foreign child. Otherwise, enter on line 5 the total qualified adoption expenses as defined by the IRS that you paid either in 2021 if the adoption was not final before the end of 2022, 2021 and 2022 if the adoption became final in 2022, or 2022 if the adoption became final before 2022. If you paid qualified adoption expenses in an attempt to adopt a U.S. child and the attempt was unsuccessful, you should treat those expenses in the same manner as expenses you paid for adoptions not final by the end of the year. For example, you paid $3,000 of qualified adoption expenses in 2021 in an attempt to adopt a child. You paid $2,000 in qualified expenses early in 2022. However, the adoption was unsuccessful. You should enter $3,000 on line 5. The $2,000 that you paid in 2022 may qualify in 2023. In line 6, you will enter the smaller of line 4 or line 5. Apologize. Line 6, you will enter the smaller of line 4 or line 5. For line 7, you will enter modified adjusted gross income. According to the instructions, you will enter the amount from IRS Form 1040, 1040-SR, or 1040-NR, line 11, increased by the total of any 1. Exclusion of income from Puerto Rico. 2. Amounts from IRS Form 2555, lines 45 and 50. And 3. Any amounts from IRS Form 4563, line 15. In line 8, you will determine if the amount in line 7 is more than $223,410. This is the beginning of the phase out. If not, you can skip lines 8 and 9 and enter 0 on line 10. If the answer is yes, you must subtract $223,410 from the amount in line 7. For line 9, you'll divide the amount in line 8 by $40,000. This is the phase out window. You'll enter this amount as a decimal rounded to at least 3 places. Do not enter a number more than 1.000. For example, if the result of subtracting $223,410 from line 7 results in $20,000, you would divide 20,000 by 40,000, resulting in a number of 0.500. For line 10, you will multiply each amount on line 6 by the number in line 5. In line 11, you'll subtract the amount on line 10 from line 6. For line 12, you'll add the amounts on line 11 for each child. In line 13, you'll enter the amount of any credit carry forward from prior tax years. You may need to see a prior year adoption credit carry forward worksheet in the 2021 form instructions. In line 14, you'll add the amounts in line 12 and line 13. And in line 15, you will enter the amount from line 5 of the credit limit worksheet in the IRS form instructions. And in the form instructions, there is a 5-step worksheet that you should use to calculate this number. In line 16, you will enter the smaller of line 14 or line 15, both here and on Schedule 3 of your Form 1040, line 6C. If line 15 is smaller than line 14, you may have a credit carry forward to 2023. You will need to use the Adoption Credit Carry Forward worksheet located in the form instructions to determine the amount of your credit carry forward. In Part 3, we will calculate the amount of employer-provided adoption benefits that may be excluded from adjusted gross income. The maximum amount of this exclusion per child is $14,890. If you and another person besides your spouse, if filing jointly, each received employer-provided adoption benefits in connection with the adoption of the same eligible child, this limit must be divided between the two of you. You can divide it in any way that you agree upon, but you must enter your share in line 17 if you're not eligible for the complete $14,890. In line 18, you'll indicate whether you received employer-provided adoption benefits for a prior year for the same child. If no, enter 0. If yes, then you should enter on line 18 the total of the amounts shown on lines 18 and 22 of the last Form 8839 that you filed for this child. In line 19, you will subtract line 18 from line 17. If you answered no to line 18, you will simply carry down the number from line 17. In line 20, you will enter the amount of employer-provided adoption benefits that you received in the tax year. This amount should be indicated in box 12 of your Form W-2 with a code of T. In line 21, you'll add all of the amounts on line 20. And in line 22, you will enter the smaller of line 19 or line 20 if the child was a child with special needs and the adoption became final in 2022, you will enter the amount from line 19. If your employer has no qualified adoption assistance program, you must enter the smaller of line 19 or line 20. In line 23, you will enter your modified adjusted gross income, which you can calculate using the modified adjusted gross income worksheet located in line 23 of the form instructions. If the amount in line 23 is more than $223,410, you will select yes for line 24 and then subtract $223,410 from the amount in line 23. If the line 23 is not more than $223,410, select no, skip lines 24 and 25 and enter 0 on line 26. Then proceed to line 27. For line 25, you will divide the number in line 24 by $40,000. Enter the result as a decimal rounded to at least 3 places, but do not enter more than 1. For example, if the amount in line 24 is $20,000, you would divide that number by $40,000, resulting in a decimal of 0.500. In line 26, you will multiply each amount on line 22 by the decimal number in line 25. For example, if child 1 had $10,000 of expenses and the decimal amount in line 25 is 0.500, then the amount you would enter would be 10,000 multiplied by 0.5, resulting in $5,000. In line 27, you will subtract line 26 from line 22, resulting in your excluded benefits. In line 28, you will add the amounts on line 27. And on line 29, if line 28 is not more than line 21, then you will select no. You will subtract line 28 from line 21. You'll also include this amount if more than 0 on line 1F of your Form 1040. If the amount on line 28 is more than line 21, you'll subtract line 21 from line 28. Enter this number as a negative number. You'll also enter this negative number on line 1F of your Form 1040. You may be able to claim the adoption credit in Part 2 on the front of this form if the following apply. Again, if you paid adoption expenses in 2021, but those expenses were not fully reimbursed and the adoption was not final by the end of 2021, you may claim those expenses in 2022. If the total adoption expenses you paid in 2022 were not fully reimbursed and the adoption became final in 2022 or earlier, or finally, if you adopted a child with special needs and the adoption became final in the current tax year. This concludes our review of IRS Form 8839, Qualified Adoption Expenses. If you would like to read more about completing this form, we've written an instructional article located on our website. Simply go to teachmepersonalfinance.com, type in IRS Form 8839 in the search bar, and you should see our article. If you like our videos, please subscribe to our YouTube channel. If you like our articles, please subscribe to our newsletter. And if you have any questions, comments, or concerns, as always, please post them in the comments section. Thank you.